process in India has, should we say, thrown up, helped increase divisions within Indian society. Sometimes when you're in sort of the cocktail party circuit, or even in a dhaba somewhere and eating, people will say, and then they'll reminisce about the fact that in the past, back in the 50s, everything was somehow, the elections would always produce a very united political structure, and now we have this amazing coalitions of parties coming to power in the center. And then you have this enormous spectrum of parties based on everything from religion to caste to ethnicity coming and going. And there is a certain concern, should we say, among some Indians that maybe this is not the way the country should be going. So, but we have a very distinguished panel to talk about this in greater detail. And I think since we are already running a little late, maybe I'll just begin by asking the first person here, Mr. N.K. Singh, to give his views. Do you think the election process in India is something that is basically divisive to the country as a whole?
Well, it's very difficult to give an answer from it in a yes or no kind of a format for several reasons. First and foremost, I think that we cannot have any fixed paradigm or a fixed conclusion on this. States, as you know, elections in India, one unfortunate fact, of course, is that if you look at the calendar of elections, there is an election almost every month taking place in India. After we got rid of the synchronization of state elections and central elections, you have a slipped cycle. Parliamentary elections, if the parliament runs for the full 5 years, well, that's a rarity. But anyway, apart from that, you have almost elections in different states in India. And now, with most states having implemented the Tier 3 administration, you have panchayat elections which are taking place also in India. So, if you look at the Indian election calendar, one extraordinary conclusion you come to is that elections are taking place almost round the year, and India is never free from this kind of an election cycle, which is unfortunate because it does not allow governments to have a reasonable period in which they can plan their economic and social strategy free from concerns on election. This is the first thing. The second is because elections are being fought quite a bit in states, they are being fought quite a bit in panchayats. States which have made a quicker transition from perhaps an agro-feudal order to the embracing of market-related principles would have less of the traditional factors of caste, communal and religious divides in dominating the electoral psyche than states which have not. And therefore you get a wide spectrum. I mean, for instance, clearly in some of the more advanced states where the index of economic development and social development has been higher, has been less dominated by divides of that kind which get somewhat exasperated as election draws near. The third very broad thing that I'd like to say, and this is based on my own personal experience, during the last election which took place about just less than a year ago, when I was involved in some of the campaign relating to my party, I discovered quite happily that in a state which is at the bottom of the development index like Bihar, in terms of the various parameters by which you judge, I had automatically assumed that a state like Bihar, the critical factor would be the caste permutation, would be the permutation relating to the religious divide and so on. But I found that the critical slogan in Bihar which worked was the development record of the chief minister, that people were, first on the development record, the first and foremost as far as Bihar was concerned, was security of life and property. And I think that people do not realize really how much this bothers the people's psyche, or whether they are free to be able to conduct their life in a manner which is not bothered about insecurity of life and property. And of course, better roads, a governance process which looked to be development-centric and so on. And I have no doubt that my party, which fought 25 Lok Sabha seats and you ended up in winning 20 seats, was driven quite a bit by Nitish Kumar's development record. And the conclusion which I drew was that if in the governance process, chief ministers and states which concentrate on broader development objectives then begin to supersede some of the other well-known traditional divides of society, particularly based on the caste and communal divide. So I think that it is fair to say that India, in general, is perhaps making a transition from a society where electoral politics and electoral engineering was primarily driven by the more traditional factors of societal divides on what we have traditionally known to divides on the governance record of the government which has gone by. And this is, Pramit, in my view, a very happy change, because we believe that this is what maturity in politics would mean when electoral battles are fought more and more. Having said that, there's only one qualifier, and that qualifier is that in a multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic society like ours, perhaps this will never be the only factor, because we do not have proportional representation. And therefore, getting an electoral pocket would be a huge help, because winning an election, you need not win anywhere near 40% of the votes to get elected. I mean, you can get a very small percentage of the total number of votes and still get elected, and therefore there is a tendency in your electoral engineering to concentrate even on the assured support of a small compact religious or a small compact caste group. So as a one final thing, I'd end up by saying that in general, I do not think that elections really pronounce the divides. I think the way in which we are going, achieving high rates of economic growth, they are mitigating the impact of the traditional social divides with which this country has been known. It will never, I think, go away in a magic, but I think as the development gathers momentum, we will have this as a mitigating factor in which the country's democratic structure becomes deeper and these divides become less and less important, and it really becomes the development record on which the electoral politics would get increasingly determined. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Well, I'd move to Manish Tiwari as a spokesperson for the Congress Party, the party that historically has been seen as a national party of India. Don't you think that the electoral process, if it wasn't producing all of these cracks and divisions within the parliamentary system, wouldn't that benefit your party?
Pramit, I think what's imperative is to contextualize the whole discussion. We are now in the 15th Lok Sabha, and between 1952 and 2009, there have been 15 general elections. Now, if you look at these elections in a perspective, you had a period from 1952 to about 2004, whereby the elections produced generally from 1952 to 1984, where elections produced generally a kind of a national mandate. This is notwithstanding that you had the linguistic reorganization in 1953, but if you look even at the 57, 62, 67 elections, people would win and lose, but by and by, elections got determined by larger and broader issues. Between 1989 and 1999, you had the reassertion of identity politics, the politics of Mandal and Kamandal. And then 2004 and 2009, there was an election on the competing visions of the idea of India. So therefore, you have a situation whereby you traverse the entire paradigm between 52 and 2009. Now, it becomes easy for any political group to try and raise the ghost of identity politics, because unfortunately the fault lines still continue to remain the same. Forward, backward, Hindu, Muslim, rich, poor. So therefore, if you press on any of these fault lines, you have a polarization which ends up benefiting X or Y who seeks to derive benefit from it. The only way that you will be able to get over this process of polarization is by having greater stake or a greater participation of the populace in the socio-economic processes. Because as the stake increases, your propensity to go towards divisive or identity-based politics becomes lesser. And I tend to completely agree with you that if it wouldn't have been for the phase of identity politics, which produced a fractured parliament, possibly the Congress would have continued doing as well as it did. But the silver lining is that 2004, 2009, while we may not be back to a simple majority, but yes, we are coming up the curve.
So now turn to Professor Shumantra Bose. You've seen the discussion that we're seeing a movement towards, should we say, an economic voting pattern coming through somewhere in this transition. What's your take on that?
Well, coming after two practitioners of politics, maybe I'll try to complement their remarks by giving a slightly more scholarly perspective on this issue. The purpose of elections in any society is actually to reflect and give political expression to the divides in the society. I mean, that's the point of elections. Elections are about competition, contestation, and contention. They're inherently contentious. And the purpose of elections anywhere is to give political expression to a variety of social and ideological cleavages that exist in the country in question. Who is to decide which divides or cleavages are narrow and therefore bad, while other divides are legitimate in some way or the other. Now, to move on from there, I think there are three factors that we need to take into consideration in considering this question in relation to the Indian context. First of all, the nature of the political parties that are engaging in this process of competition, contestation, and contention. I think any balanced party system needs to be comprised both of communitarian and segmental parties, which is inevitable given the great diversity of our country, the myriad identity and interest groups that exist, and parties, but those parties are particularist by definition, and parties which seek to aggregate interests, collective interests and identities in some form, which are not inherently particularist. I think over the last 2 decades, since the watershed election of November 1989, exactly 20 years ago, the Indian party system is in a state of transition and is trying to work out an equilibrium which is as yet unsettled between these two types of political party, segmental and communitarian parties, and the more identity and interest aggregating parties, and we are not at the end of the process yet. The second factor that we need to consider in relation to India is actually the nature of the divides, the political issues that are involved. Here we need to consider, I think, the intensity of the divides. Certain conflicts of identity and interest are more divisive than others. They are more intense. They involve intensity of belief on the part of the protagonists that are not easily manageable within the framework of electoral politics. Now, fortunately, those issues are still relatively few, and the majority of divides and issues that we see in the electoral politics of our country are in fact amenable to compromise and accommodation, and I think our political system is elastic enough and adaptable enough to do that. But there are certain kinds of issues which are not contained within the framework of electoral politics at certain points in time, and that spillover into the extra-systemic domain. So that happens as well. And whether or not that happens is, I think, crucially dependent on the third factor that I want to emphasize, the responsibility of party leaderships and political elites. I think whether or not divides are mediated, through electoral politics, and some kind of an accommodation and mutual compromise is found, or certain divides spill over into the extra-systemic domain, depends crucially on whether political elites and party leaderships are willing and able to act with a minimal degree of responsibility, whether they are prepared to abide by certain basic rules of the game or not. This is the question of virtue in politics, and certainly, one can't be, idealistic about the nature of politics anywhere, and certainly not in India. But I think a minimum degree of virtue is essential if we are going to tackle our many divides in a democratic way. It can't be all vice and no virtue. It can be, as is the case everywhere, mostly vice, but a little, dollop of virtue here and there, now and then, is, I think, absolutely essential. Thank you.
So finally, I'll turn to Dr. Pratap Bhanumehta and continue the academic discourse.
Well, maybe I'll try and be political for a change.
Okay.
I mean, I think if you ask yourself two questions, is the Indian Union stronger and is Indian democracy better now than it was 15, 20 years ago? Think of the late 70s, early 80s. I think the answer would be yes. That's one possible answer to this question of, do elections divide us? There's an old saying it's actually was, I think, Hazari Prasad Dwivedi. I'll use the line in Hindi. He made an insightful remark once that he said, "Bharat ka loknayak wohi ho sakta hai, jo samanvay kar sake." Only that person can be, in a sense, the popular Nayak of India who can synthesize. If you look at our central government leadership, by and large, it has had to move in that position, whichever party it came from. Okay? If somebody had said, would the representative of a Dravidian movement, identity movement, somebody like Jayalalitha, have to tie up with a Hindu nationalist party from the north, we would have laughed at that idea in the 60s. Or that the BSP would have to reach out for the Brahmin vote. We would have laughed at that idea. So I think, in short, it's a way of saying that democracy has actually, and electoral politics has actually been, for the most part, a synthesizing force, not a fragmenting one. The real interesting question is, why do we think it has been a fragmenting force? And there, I think a couple of things need to be said. First of all, I think building on the point Professor Bose just made, which is absolutely right, which is, I think we always assume that politicians are doing things because they are making the right electoral calculations. So the syllogism is, if politicians are engaging in identity politics, it must be because they think they're getting electoral returns, therefore elections must be leading to identity politics. The simple truth is, politicians are often very bad judges of what the public mood demands, which is why we had the highest anti-incumbency rate for so long. Right? Politicians are guided by a variety of motives, just like anybody else. And so I think the interesting question is, why do we semi-regularly produce politicians who are tempted by divisive politics, and occasionally by politicians who will not resist that, despite overwhelming electoral evidence? And I don't think the answer to that will lie in elections. The second question is that in some senses our electoral politics is not divisive enough. It's not divisive enough because the impression you get often is this gap between popular authorization and legitimacy in electoral politics. So elections are really about choosing governments. We have a menu of choices. First of all, we think elections are divisive because the menu seems so limited in the first place. Right? And there doesn't seem to be the requisite degree of democratic control over how the menu comes to be set. Right? Entry barriers to politics are extremely high. Most political parties don't have genuine intra-party democracy. So you So we assume that the criteria by which candidates are being selected, right, don't have necessarily to do with competence in the kinds of criteria we would like them to be selected by, but by some other considerations. And again, then we sort of read off, it must be there for caste or electoral arithmetic or something like that, right? So I think this question is more an expression of our disenchantment with the limited menu of choices that our democracy still seems to offer despite everything else, and the way in which that menu is tightly controlled. It's more a reflection of the fact that democracy has turned out to be also an extremely conservative force in some ways. And this is one of the striking facts about electoral democracy. In the 19th century, you would have asked somebody, what do you expect a democracy to produce? They would have said, probably more class conflict. The poor should be voting out the rich. The less marginalized should be voting out the more privileged. The fundamental paradox of a democracy is nothing like that happens. In fact, democracy is a perfect instrument by which the powers of entrenched power structures are actually enhanced and furthered. And so the question we need to ask is, why don't we get the right kind of conflict in this democracy where there seems to be too little of? And frankly, all the talk about governance and so forth, most democracies and the cause of social justice is advanced by partisanship and contention. It's not advanced by nice consensus around public goods and governance and all these sort of, sort of things which sound as if there's a consensus behind them. So the question I would want to ask is, in a sense, why is it that we don't get the right kind of contestation and partisanship and division? That, I think, is a much more serious challenge to a democracy than the fear that elections will divide us.
Well, that's an interesting point. Every time I vote, I'm always amazed at the size of the ballot that I'm normally presented with. But so let me raise this issue then. Mr. Singh, do you think the menu is too limited in Indian democracy?
No, I'm afraid I don't agree with my good friend that the menu is too limited. If for the same reason which, for instance, Sumantro said, and also Manish pointed out, that if you look at really the India's election whole matrix, you'll find that you had homogeneous governments for a very long time in the post-independence period. You did not have any regional parties. You had virtually the same party which was ruling at the center. You had the replication of that model in the states. That has now reversed to the complete other extreme when you have regional parties in large parts of India which have a menu and an agenda of their own. We have come to accept a kind of a coalition politics which provides the menu. I mean, for instance, episodically, this present government, if we talk about it, surely a lot of the government's intrinsic agenda had been substantially diluted by an alternative menu which some of the allied partners have brought in. There is the DMK which has brought in a new menu. The Trinamool Congress has a new menu. To some extent, the party which has come from Maharashtra has brought in a new. So I think that problem really is that the menu is too big. And my fear is that unless there is a genuine consolidation of regional parties and a strengthening of the national mainstream parties, this menu may become larger and larger, which will offer to some extent a bewildering choice. The difficult question really, Mehta, is that, I mean, if there are, unfortunately there aren't credible surveys on this, if you look at the changing electoral preferences over time between different elections, and what are the issues which have dominated an electoral choice, and if that sample is robust enough, it will throw out a set of conclusions which will be quite bewildering in terms of the wide variety of reasons and the wide menu which exists.
Well, Manish, do you think you'd like to add something to that? Do you think
no, I think I would tend to agree with what Dr. N.K. Singh said. The menu is indeed very diverse, and just to exemplify that, I keep telling all my friends in the media that the concerns which are articulated in Delhi, they are really concerns which are relevant 2.5 miles of Raisina Hill. The moment you travel 100 kilometers out of Delhi, those concerns become absolutely different, and we do it day in and day out, because when you go back to the constituency, okay, and which is not the back of beyond, you know, Ludhiana happens to be the largest industrial center in North India, you find that, you know, the concerns are completely different. So there is an alternative narrative in Delhi, which is not in tune with what the aspirational reality is on the ground. So therefore, the menu is indeed very diverse, and if you keep making this menu more diverse, I'm afraid you're going to run into governance issues. And what Mr. N.K. Singh said was very right. If somebody narrowly focuses on a certain identity which can get him an X number of seats in parliament, his ability to be able to hold the governance agenda to ransom is infinitesimal. You've seen that over the last decade. So there is a need for strengthening mainstream parties, as he said, and there is also a need for ensuring that regional parties develop or evolve a national outlook. Otherwise, we are going to be in a problem.
But to some degree, what you're saying, I think, almost supports what Dr. Mehta is saying, that if there is an agenda that's only 2.5 miles around Raisina Hill that was going on here, but I know he wants to say something. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say that in fact, it was exactly the point, which is that what comes to Delhi and what gets articulated here through the political process doesn't reflect what's actually happening out there. That is the narrowing of the menu. But let's take forward. The fact that there is a large number of parties does not mean that there is a diversity of ideological options to choose from. Okay, so that's the sense in which diversity of menu matters for politics. Take another interesting fact. Most of our political parties have actually pretty similar organizational structures. I mean, it's interesting how very few political parties have institutionalized intra-party democracy, right? So even the institutional forms that they take, which is centered around single dominant leaders, under-institutionalized modes of incorporation, are actually pretty similar. So you don't have actually institutional choice, you don't have ideological choice, you don't have institutional choice. What you do have is fragmented veto points, a proliferation of veto points, which themselves are a product of the fact that the national parties were not willing to create internal institutions to incorporate more diverse points of view. The reason people set up political parties was because there was no point joining an existing one. You didn't know what the rules of the game in this party is. You don't know how do you get to run to be for election in this political party, what those rules are. So it makes sense for you to set up your own political parties.
So, Dr. Bose, you've argued that this is a state of transition. In fact, to some degree, all of us have here. So do you see this? Do you see these criticisms or these concerns to be something that will continue for some time? Do you see some trends that are heading in the right direction then?
I probably tend more towards the view expressed by Mr. Singh than by Dr. Mehta, that there is a danger of overloading the menu. But I think that the real risk of destabilization comes from political mismanagement and bungling of major issues. And more often than not, the political mismanagement and bungling, and here I'm echoing a point that Dr. Mehta made in his remarks a while ago, that most of the time the political mismanagement and bungling of major issues is not deliberate. It's more a reflection of ineptitude or inadequate or faulty understanding of the situation rather than deliberately malign. But the effects are no less malign or destructive because of that. It's not intended, but the effect is, the consequences are malign and destabilizing.
But but that was always one of the arguments and one of the benefits of democracy is that even if you bungle, you can only bungle for 5 years, and then theoretically, if everybody understands you've bungled, you're out of office. So, Singh, I go back to you again. Do you? One of the things, of course, you've just talked about the question of choice, but you also raised, I thought, what were the key elements of the transition that we perhaps are going through, which is the rise of development economics. I think it was Montek Singh Ahluwalia who said that the number one indicator of your likelihood of being re-elected is, I think, infrastructure development or something on that lines, he said. And I was just curious, say, the development agenda as it's building up, how strong is that going to be? You said it's never going to completely overwhelm the electoral system, but what are the trends that we are seeing here?
Well, I think that, you know, one of the statistics which I'm sure that my good friend Bhanuji would have gathered, let us say that in the last elections which have come, and Manish should know this very well, the percentage of people who have been re-elected, who have had a controversial criminal record, has dramatically gone down.
Yeah.
Now, that's obviously something to be said in terms of the maturity of the choice patterns which have been exercised. The chief ministers and those people who have been seen to pursue an active development strategy seems to have done much better than those who are really been perceived to be people who are pursuing a more partisan agenda. I tend to share Manish's views that if you look at also the evolution of the choice, parties which were pursuing perhaps an excessively religious-based focus agenda seems to have in general lost ground to parties which were pursuing a broader-based development agenda. And this is evident in more states than one. And therefore, in general, I would say that people have opted for, and whereas I agree with Bhanuji that perhaps governance may be a somewhat amorphous expression, which is in many ways non-quantifiable, but to try and quantify it, it means offering better security of life and property in terms of crime patterns, a better quality of road, perhaps a better assurance of electrical energy availability, a better emphasis on integration of the rural economy, and in general perhaps making the trickle-down effect of growth become more and more visible to the less marginalized and less advantaged sections of society whose electoral voice has become felt increasingly in this particular last election than I feel in so many other previous elections.
So Manish, do you think that as a practitioner of politics, with presumably more virtue than vice, as Dr. Bose is saying, and I think that Mr. Singh indicates that we're seeing definitely more virtue, at least in terms of criminal records in politics. Do we see that happening? Do we see the development agenda in many ways becoming the primary part of the political package that sells in India today?
No, I just wanted to pick up from where Mr. Pratap Mehta left about ideological choices.
Right.
You know, throughout the 20th century, you really had two ideological choices, the left and the right, and variations of the left and right. In fact, the best thing which could have possibly happened to India was in 1991 when you had the liberation from ideology, because you were, you know, moved as a country, you know, left of the center, and then you had this whole collapse, and you had a liberation from ideology. And what it has done, and that is where Mr. N.K. Singh's point comes in and gets reinforced, that is the ideology of public goods is coming. However, Mr. Pratap Mehta might say that is unquantifiable. When you go down to the grassroots, what people want today is the efficacious delivery of those public goods. That has become the overriding ideology, and that is the developmental agenda.
So Pratap, I'll go back to you then. We're seeing, so the argument seems to be that we are, yes, there may be less choice per se, but that's partly because the electorate has come to, I wouldn't say a consensus, but there seems to be a learning process within the electorate which is now focusing on a development agenda, and that is proving to be limiting in terms of ideological choice, but ultimately that's what the electorate seems to want.
I actually agree with that, but I would characterize it differently, because I think it's important to be very clear about what this is, right? Which is, of course, I mean, in fact, the electorate, I would argue that even in the so-called era of divisive politics and identity politics, I think that was actually endogenous to the fact that the state was not delivering anything, so these became default axes of mobilization. The second thing that has changed as a result of growth, and I think this will transform Indian politics very significantly, is the stakes of government intervention have magnified hugely and dramatically. You know, 10 or 15 years ago, even the most ambitious government scheme on roads, employment guarantee was, you know, if you did 1,000 crores, it's a big scheme, right? Now you're talking 80,000 crores, 150,000 crores. And what that has done is that it has actually changed the incentives for the politicians. And I think I agree with Mr. Renkesing. It has changed the incentives for the politicians in the following sense. For about 20 years between, like roughly between the mid-70s and late 90s, we were in an equilibrium where even the best politician with all the great virtues would have best have a marginal impact in a 5-year cycle. How many schools could you build? If you did, you know, a few kilometers of roads, it was great if they didn't break down. Now, what politicians do have is instruments that can send a visible signal to the electorate that they're actually doing something. Delhi's budget has gone from 4,000 crores to 40,000 crores, right? So in that sense, of course, development discourse is going to come to dominate. But I think one has to be careful, which is, yes, there is a convergence around public goods, but look, politics is ultimately distributive as well. You cannot ignore a distributive dimension of politics. And the question is whether this ideology of public goods is a kind of palliative, or whether this allows the ideological space for actually having a much more interesting contestation around the distributive aspects of politics, between left and right in a genuine sense. I think that's still very much an open question.
So Dr. Bose, you had mentioned that you had talked about the intensity of the divides, but I think what Dr. Mehta is sort of raising here is the intensity, if you wish, of the development, that this may be overriding everything else. What's your take on that?
I think that it's too early as yet to speak of a decisive shift from identity-based voting, you know, people voting like, you know, quote-unquote cattle, I mean, no disrespect meant, to performance-based voting. The evidence is as yet, you know, patchy and uneven across the country, but the trend is in that direction. There is a shift that's ongoing from identity-based voting to performance-based voting, and it's certainly a very positive and healthy trend. But when I think of other democracies which have a longer history than ours, because we're only 62 years old, you know, lots of voters in such democracies continue to vote, at least in part, you know, sometimes entirely, for identity-based reasons, for emotive reasons. And they're swayed by that. Yeah. And politicians, of course, appeal to those you know, emotions and you know, identity or self-identity perceptions. And that's really quite legitimate as a reason for voting. And only in part in democracies with a longer, you know, history than ours is voting based on quote-unquote rational assessment of credentials and agendas. So I would think that the same is true for India, that you know, certain people vote primarily on the basis of identity, and others are more quote-unquote rational in their choices and decisions, and the two can and should coexist.
Right. And I think this is an important issue. I think that just because you may be playing identity politics doesn't necessarily mean you don't have a development agenda attached to it. Yeah. And that's one of the things I'd like to raise is that identity politics, if you wish, can be conflated with development, which means, though, that the identity issue, or if you wish to put it negatively, the divisiveness issue, still can remain very much embedded in Indian politics. How would you react to that, Mr. Singh?
Well, I mean, I said as my first comment that difficult to oversimplify. It's difficult to draw fixed paradigms. And if you add up the total number of seats, if you add up, for instance, two houses of parliament, about 800 plus. If you add up all the states, you add up by another factor, it would be perhaps 7,000-8,000. You please add up all the panchayat elections, you get a mind-boggling number on which the electoral choices are exercised. And I agree entirely with Sumantra that it's difficult to draw oversimplified conclusions that voter everywhere in these thousands of elections which are taking place would vote in the same way. But I think over a period of time, and that was the proposition, I entirely agree with him that more time would be needed to come to a categorical conclusion. But the trends which we are seeing are trends in which for large number of elections, the identity factors are getting smothered increasingly by development-related issues and in terms of life quality, security of life and property.
So Manish, one of the things that you're in the thick of it. You're in the Lok Sabha where the scrums are the toughest, and the rugby matches are quite evident. Do you see a situation where, let's say, if everybody adopts, should we say, a development agenda, and then puts their identity politics on top of it, you could actually see eventually that the trend towards development, not so much as Trump identity, as just be a component of an identity politics that suddenly becomes, once again, a major issue in Indian politics, on the grounds that everybody is doing exactly the same thing on the agenda, on the development front?
Well, the search for identity through development, I think, is best exemplified by the second reorganization of states which took place in 2000. You had the first reorganization on a linguistic basis. Then you had the second reorganization whereby states said, or within states, regions said, that we want to move away because we are being denied our legitimate share of the developmental cake. And that is what you're seeing even happening now. So therefore, there is a convergence of development and identity to that aspect, in that aspect. But what Mr. Mehta had said about the distributive aspect of politics today. You see, the state was increasingly interventionist between 1952 to 1991, but the state had much less to offer. Between 1991 and 2009, the state may not be that interventionist, but it has much more to offer. So in that sense, it has brought development to the forefront. But yes, you are today seeing a case where there's a convergence of identity and development taking place.
Dr. Bose, do you see that happening? Do you see that identity and should we say, fusing with development and producing the kind of moderation in a mature democracy that a mature democracy would expect?
It's a big question. I mean, that would be a very happy convergence. I guess one needs to look at it contextually and on a case-by-case basis. But I agree that the formation of the 3 new states about 9 years ago is a very good example. I mean, just to add to what Manish said, the question is whether the formation of new states has in fact, facilitated a development. It's clearly, has, if not resolved, it has addressed some identity issues. But I think the jury is still out on the development record of the new states.
I'll just turn to Mr. Singh, because I know he actually has to go and practice some politics in 5 minutes. He actually has to go to Parliament. So you're actually you're helping run the economy of one of the states that at least has been cut in half, the northern section of it. How would you respond to what Dr. Bose said?
No, I think that I entirely agree with Savantra that the jury is still out, that the division of the states has led to a mixed record, and it will take much longer to come to the conclusion whether development necessarily has been fostered in all the cases where the states have been divided. So leaving aside that issue, I think that, and the broader issue of what should be the optimum size of a state, what are the considerations which should prompt, apart from the issues of identity, whether in terms of self-sufficiency and in terms of development, what kind of a reorganization of states would really subserve that long-term thing. Bihar, since you raised that issue of my involvement in Bihar's development, well, I think that the Bihar really, everybody agrees, in the last 4.5 years, has seen a significant turnaround in its development metrics. We have forged ahead in concentrating Bihar's governance process into better quality of life for the people who have voted for this government. And I think that all available objective indicators are that we have tried to optimize on our comparative factor advantages and optimize on the areas where we seem to have lagged behind in the past.
So, Dr. Mehta, sorry,
No, just to build on this, I mean, one, I think we all agree that, there's no simple binary between development and identity. But I think the more fundamental question on how we look at this relationship is the central challenge in a democracy is how do you aggregate preferences and at what level do you actually articulate them. And the interesting paradox of our moment is the following, which is that the bigger worry or challenge, the bigger challenge is going to be this, which is, are our formal institutions structured in a way that allow legitimate expressions of identity and interest to emerge and be recognized? Right? We are all very proud of the fact that we have so many panchayat elections. But we should reflect on the fact that panchayats are still extraordinarily weak institutions in India, and in part have been deliberately made so by the structures of identity politics that have been formally inscribed into them. Once you do rotation, you know the bargaining panchayat of power of panchayats in relation to other branches of government goes down. Right? Municipal governments, city identities, which are immensely important in a developing economy, are not in a sense flowering as much because of the pressures of the kinds of state politics we have. Right? So I think we need to ask some systematic questions about the relationship between the formal institutions and the way they express identities and aggregate interests, right? And whether they are actually rightly designed to respond to precisely these pressures coming from below. I mean, it's ironic, everybody in Andhra Pradesh is talking about, sub-regional identity. 73rd, 74th Amendment were the most potent instruments of participation, efficient government, representation, yet they are being systematically weakened in every state, almost every state. We need to talk about those kinds of issues.
Yes, I agree. But now we have still a substantial amount of time, so I'm going to ask the audience if they have any questions. Those in the back should wave their hand vigorously because the lights are shining right into my eye. Okay, I can see a hand there waving.
I agree the nation heaved a collective sigh of relief after the last election results, and there's a comfortable feeling coming from the discussion of the panelists. But there are dark clouds on the electoral process horizon which are not even being touched. The results of the last elections were predicated on two facts: the length of time taken by the election commission in each of the states and the number of paramilitary forces you deployed, which means that there is no state in India which can be trusted, its police or civil services, to hold elections in a fair manner if paramilitary forces, central forces are not deployed. That's my first question. Second, again, there was a very comfortable thing that yes, some of the known criminals have been thrown out, but if you take the strength now of criminals with heinous crimes, I'm not talking of frivolous charges, that have come into the Lok Sabha, it keeps growing up, and the state legislatures. I only said half jestingly in another forum when former Chief Justice Verma was sitting there, chairing it, that after 5-10 years, their number exceeds 50% of all electorates, if the trend continues, which means if the criminals in Parliament and the legislatures unite and say, let's have an arch criminal as your president, your system is being degraded. That's my thing. My name is Vinod Sehgal. I started the Movement for Restoration of Good Government, MRGG, in 1995. Your comments.
Thank you. Was there anybody specifically wishes to answer any of these? Manish, would you like to handle the law and order question?
No, insofar as the law and order issue is concerned, you're correct that there is a demand, especially if you happen to be an opposition candidate in a state where another party is ruling, to get the paramilitary forces in to ensure a free and fair elections. But if you look at it on the ground, the paramilitary forces are really spread very thin. And this is evidenced by, if you talk to any of the election observers, even in states which, let's say, are Naxalite prone, districts which are joined that Naxalite area had a very thin presence. So eventually, the election is rarely conducted by the state police in conjunction with the state civil service, and the paramilitary at best plays a supporting role. That also dependent upon whether the district administration at all allows it to play a role. So I would not really be so pessimistic about the efficacy of our state police and the civil service. I think they have performed reasonably well. Of course, there is scope to do better. On criminalization, you see, the larger question on criminalization is how do you turn jurisprudence on its head? The Indian criminal jurisprudence as it stands says that you are innocent until proven guilty. And our legal processes, unfortunately, take an abysmal amount of time. So therefore, how do you turn this jurisprudence on its head and say that, look, if you've been accused of a particular offense, you are debarred from contesting an election? So that is the fundamental challenge as to how do we deal with it.
Okay. There's a person here. You have a microphone.
This is a question and comment for Manish Tiwari. You started by saying that politics of Mandal and Kamandal in 90s are behind us. I would like to make a small comment and invite your reaction. That don't you think that 50s, 60s and 70s were largely free from this, but it is Mrs. Gandhi who started identity politics by pandering to Babas publicly, Dhirendra Brahmachari, and stoking religious fundamentalism in Punjab. Later, Rajiv Gandhi unlocked Babri Masjid gates, carried out Shilanyas, and then even affirmative action by giving his views. What are your comments on that?
Well, if you spelled out such a large menu going over 3 decades of Indian politics, that will possibly take me about 3 hours to answer that. So I don't think I would even attempt to go into it because the issues are very complex and each of them, requires a very, very detailed answer. But I think if the Congress would have been as bad as people make it out to be in the decades of the 50s, 60s and 70s, we wouldn't have been coming back again and again repeatedly.
There's a hand in the back there. There's another one. Okay, after these two.
My question is for Mr. Manish Tiwari. I'm Barun from ILM College of Management Studies. So today we are seeing so many parties like the TRS, MNS or the Gorkha Janmukti Morcha. They're exploiting this factor of caste, creed, language, and the government at the center is not dealing with a stern hand. So in this age, where is the whole concept of India is for Indians gone? Thank you, sir.
Well, I would answer that strictly in my personal capacity because given the very surcharged atmosphere, there is potential for being misunderstood. I don't see a fundamental incompatibility between the two situations. Essentially, like you can have a debate about the efficacy of big states qua small states. Whether big states are better or small states are better. My personal view is both of them are not. The essential thing is that who delivers public goods in the most efficacious manner. That is what matters. And the experience that we've had with both big and small states actually testifies to that. And within that paradigm, if somebody has regional aspirations, I don't think that inherently makes him anti-India.
There's a lady in the back who is...
Good afternoon, sir. I'm an Amanta Fellow and my name is Naglakshmi, doing my electrical engineering in Rajya Engineering College, Chennai. My question is that why is there a partial awareness in time of election? Election Commission always promotes about how to use an voting machine and everything very nicely. But why is that they don't create the awareness to people that you can have an option of not voting to anybody? Why is there always a partial awareness to people? And why is it always biased on the politician side? This is my question.
And this is, let's give Manish a break. Pratap, would you like to answer?
I mean, to be honest, I don't think that is a particularly significant issue. I mean, I think on these basics, voters are actually quite savvy. And the last thing you want is sort of government machinery in your face doing it. I mean, I think the more interesting question is, which is a big logistical exercise in a country like India about, how do you manage the process of elections? But I don't think it's a big, hugely significant issue that the Election Commission is not publicizing the options. I think voters know them perfectly well.
Okay. Gentleman in the front.
My name is Kanan Jaiswal, and I study good governance. Well, suppose we grant this, that elections do encourage divisive tendencies among the electorates and all, in fact. Do you think that the 100% voting, insistence on 100% voting, will take care of it? Because then you won't have this kind of thing that with just 20% or 30% people voting for you, in the first past post the system, you can still get elected. So you definitely then pander to some sections of society. It could be Dalits, it could be Brahmins, something like that. Do you think that an answer to this is 100% voting made compulsory?
Dr. Bose, would you like to take a look?
There are a few democracies which have compulsory voting. I don't think that's the answer here to our dilemmas, and it's probably not suitable for our political and cultural context. In fact, an argument can be made that compelling people to vote is in itself, or can become, an undemocratic act. So I don't think that's the way to go. I think healthy turnouts should be encouraged, and I come from a state where the turnout in both the national and state elections is in the region of 80% consistently over several decades now, 3 decades. And so I'm always a little bit well, not quite shocked, but disconcerted when I see that in some other parts of the country, especially in the north, 40%, 50% turnout is the norm. So I'm all for encouraging, higher turnouts and, greater participation rates, especially when there are, so many identity and interest groups competing and jostling for political space, representation and office. But compulsory voting is, I think, is going too far.
Dr. Mehta, you want to...
Just 2 quick points on this. One, you have this yes phenomenon of some candidates getting elected with, 10, 15, 20% of the vote, but that's a function of the number of candidates, nothing to do with turnouts or something. So analytically, making 100% people turn out does not necessarily address the problem. But the second thing I will say, and because it's not said often enough, I think we underestimate the virtues of a first past the post constituency-based system. In comparative perspective, because by and large the experience of Indian democracy has been that over time it actually forces, one of the nice things about a territorial constituency is that it is a representative sample, it has different kinds of people in it, right? And over time it actually does force political parties to have cross-group conversations in ways in which other electoral systems don't necessarily encourage, and have to do it at a day-to-day level. So I think these quick fixes are probably more counterproductive than the kinds of things that Professor Bose is talking about, which is getting turnouts, political involvement, and so forth.
I can testify to the fact that I used to live in Calcutta and I moved to Delhi, and despite my knowing it, I voted in both cities for 2 elections. Your turn.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Sir, my name is Gaurav Rasool. I am pursuing my MBA in Lovely Professional University, and I am also the fellow of Avanta. The general question, sir, I am also to all the experts, panel of experts right here. Why Indian politics has not ever been able to fascinate the Indian citizens? And the second thing, sir, our former Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee Sahab, they used to say that एक नया भारत बनाने का इरादा मन में है. नया भारत तो देखने को नहीं मिला, मगर एक नई सरकार देखने को जरूर मिली. We have never been able to satisfy the generation who is existing. I just want to know where the major loophole lies. And if you know the loophole, what is the corrective measure for that? Thank you.
Oh, so, Manish, do you want to take a look, crack at the youth vote?
Well, I think there's a virtue in not animating the younger generation. And that virtue is that it becomes the catalyst of change. So therefore, if a government is not really not able to identify with the younger generation for whatever reasons, and various governments have tried it in various ways, including by lowering the voting age and stuff like that, it becomes the catalyst for change and keeps democracy vibrant and healthy.
Okay, I know there's a person in the back who's been patiently waiting. Yes.
My name is Hari Hegde. I work for Wipro. My question is for Mr. Mehta. It's more a clarification. Mr. Mehta, what you were actually indicating by the need to offer a wider menu, were you actually hinting at a political election, even including an intra-party structure that would give space for wider electoral preferences, and a structure that would finally also look at aggregating it at a national level? That's the question that I have.
Very briefly, I think the wide menu, you can look on 2 or 3 different dimensions. First is clearly ideological. I mean, of course, you don't want an endless menu and you don't want 5 or 6 ideas. But I think you want a healthy political system where there is actually a key a significant difference between at least 2 or 3 of the major alternatives on offer. And those differences don't quite exist in our system, despite the proliferation of political parties. So genuine ideological choice. The second widening of the menu is, as I said, is that the process by which the menu of choices in terms of candidates comes to be set, that process itself is quite closed. It's closed by all kinds of entry barriers, organizational entry barriers of parties. It's closed by the power of money, which we haven't talked about. If you look at actually turnover, you know, in more than 250 odd constituencies in India, power has actually oscillated between 3 or 4 families over the last 25 years, even though there has been occasional displacement. So you need to open up in a sense that menu. You need to open up the menu in terms of where grassroots leader.
We're a little over time. We're breaking now for tea. The next session will begin at 3:30 in about 14 minutes from now. Thank you.